We are back and happy to welcome back to the show Dr. Annelle Sheline, research fellow at the Middle East in the Middle East program at the Quincy Institute, former foreign affairs officer at the U.S. Department of State's Bureau on Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor's Office of Near Eastern Affairs. Annelle resigned over the Biden administration's Gaza policy in March 2024. Thanks so much for coming back on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
So, of course, the news is moving very fast right now. There has been some reporting on this deal that was reached that Netanyahu has once again reportedly thrown a wrench into the ceasefire deal at the 11th hour. He delayed a cabinet vote on this ceasefire deal, and the Smotrich and Ben Gvir, if they left together, they could bring down his coalition, and they're unhappy with the idea that there would be any peace deal with Hamas or whatever. And then this morning I saw that Netanyahu or his office put out a statement denying that Israeli forces would withdraw troops from the Philadelphia corridor, which was a part of the agreement. So he's basically contradicting what the agreement says and then blaming it on Hamas. And then last night as well, they escalated their bombing campaign against Palestinians and killed at least 70 people. So sure looks like he's trying to sabotage this ceasefire deal, but what's your assessment of what we've seen over the past 48 hours?
Like you said, it's been such an emotional roller coaster. My initial reaction yesterday was immediate pessimism as far as, my sense of it is that Trump just wanted this for his inauguration, and I didn't expect the ceasefire to outlive Monday. He just wants it in place for inauguration, and then Israel will be free to go back to its genocide of Palestinians in Gaza. I got some pushback yesterday, people saying, look, Trump does have interests in this not being a problem that he has to deal with. And, I hope that is true. But I think that clearly whatever Trump has promised Netanyahu, and that Netanyahu has also promised Smotrich and Ben Gvir, as well as Israeli society, much of whom remains fully committed to the genocide of Palestinians in Gaza, unfortunately. The notion that, they'll go right back to fighting, that perhaps the promising American support for annexation of the West Bank, I think that is something to keep in mind in general, that from the perspective of the Israeli far right, the West Bank is a much bigger prize than Gaza, although I think from their perspective, they would like to maintain the assault on Gaza and annex the West Bank. From Trump's perspective, he's going to need to be able to show something to Mohammed bin Salman and the Saudis if he's going to achieve Israeli-Saudi normalization, which he thinks will earn him a Nobel Peace Prize.
Oh gosh, from a guy that photoshopped himself into Time Magazine most important person of the year for his golf resorts. That is the exact kind of thing that he would be drawn towards. It's just the idea that he could get some sort of fancy award. But there is, I think, and I agree with your assessment, but I do think that there's an interesting dynamic here where it seems that clearly Netanyahu was holding off, obviously, on making a deal with the Biden administration, in part because the Biden administration didn't use any leverage. Not in part. This is the reason. And so the blame 100% lies with Biden here. But from Netanyahu's perspective, it very much mirrors the Iran hostages, Jimmy Carter's deal being scuttled so that, and Reagan making these back channel deals so that he could take credit. And then on his inauguration day, the hostages were released. There is historical precedent for this. But I do wonder, was Netanyahu potentially caught off guard by how forceful Trump was with this? Because there is reporting about how his Middle Eastern envoy was like, I don't care if this is a religious time to take off work. We're forcing this through anyway. That's from the outside is what it looks like.
No, I agree with you that 100% this demonstrates that Biden refused to use pressure. And this is what I observed inside the State Department, this sort of hand-wringing that, we're working tirelessly towards a ceasefire, as if the United States isn't directly enabling everything the Israeli military is doing, and that, even just the breadth of pressure from Trump coming in, who's not even president yet, got Netanyahu to provisionally agree to the ceasefire. As we said, it's unclear to what extent it will in fact manifest. I totally agree with you in terms of the parallels to the Iran hostage deal. As you said, the back channel deal to tank Carter's reelection campaign. I think it's, although yesterday all of the focus was on the hopeful announcement of a ceasefire, there was also news that came out yesterday about the results of a YouGov and IMEU poll, which showed that 29% of people who voted for Biden in 2020 but didn't vote for Harris in 2024 cited Gaza as their number one reason for not voting. This was over the economy. This was over immigration. My hope is that Democrats are listening, and that moving forwards, they will understand that this was a huge part of why they lost the election. Obviously not the only issue. But clearly, Biden refused to use any pressure. Harris refused to break with him on that. This is part of why Trump won. And now, unfortunately, I think what everybody keeps saying, especially on social media, because I've been emphasizing, like, this is clearly a win for Trump. And people say, well, why are you giving Trump the win? And I'm saying it is a win for Trump, but it could have been a win for Biden. And he just refused to take the win. Right. And again, I think in the end, the Trump administration is playing all of us who are desperately hoping for peace for the Palestinian people, as well as the return of hostages held in Gaza.
And you mentioned that it could have been a win for Biden, but I'm curious, as in your role at the State Department, I know you weren't there for too long, but I did find ProPublica is doing phenomenal reporting on the suppression of dissent by the Biden administration on this very topic, which you experienced firsthand. But ProPublica, I thought it was really notable, reported that the State Department was, quote, marginalized in the last year, and that this policy has largely been the result of the National Security Council, which is a White House advisory board, but not the State Department is supposed to be our constitutional foreign policy arm, but the NSC has grown in power since its formation in the middle of the 20th century, and the article really said that Jake Sullivan, Brett McGurk, Amos Hochstein were significant players in this policy. Now, with the way that Biden performed at the debate and with how rudderless our leadership has seemed, I think this begs the question of how much were they entirely running this? And does this seem like the way that a policy would be run if it were run by career national security folks like Sullivan, Brett McGurk, and Amos Hochstein? Because to me, that's what it looks like.
I definitely agree with you that this was coming from people like Brett McGurk, Jake Sullivan, other people at the National Security Council, rather than from the State Department. That's not to say that Antony Blinken was not a willing participant. I just don't think he was in the driver's seat. And really to commend Brett Murphy at ProPublica, who's been doing amazing reporting on all of this. I think that this just does indicate the way that the State Department has been marginalized for a long time. There were a lot of other people at the State Department who were trying to speak out against this, who were doing what they could within their limited channels to try to achieve a change. And this was coming directly from the top. So this was a big part of why I left, this question of, well, shouldn't you stay on the inside and do what you can on the inside? You couldn't change anything on the inside unless you were in the position of someone like Brett McGurk or Jake Sullivan. At the same time, I don't want to take away Biden's responsibility. Clearly, he is a committed Zionist and was fine with all of this. But I agree with you that it was he had expressed his preferences and then let his close advisors really drive what was happening moving forward. But I do think he was fully in support of it. I think another really important thing to keep in mind as we transition to the Trump administration, I mean, as people have said, I mean, Trump is not going to be better for Palestine. And in many ways, people have said, how could it get worse? It could get worse, especially with the annexation of the West Bank. This is something that came up when I was in Jordan. Jordanians are very concerned about this. I think another really scary thing that Trump may have promised to Netanyahu and possibly the Saudis is some kind of security guarantee for Saudi Arabia in exchange for Israeli normalization, which would require the United States military to fight to defend Saudi Arabia, which would be an incredibly foolhardy policy to undertake, especially because of the moral hazard that would create for Saudi Arabia. So the same way that we've seen this unconditional support for Israel generating this incredibly aggressive foreign policy with Israel invading Lebanon, continually violating that so-called ceasefire, invading Syria, destroying their military, possibly prepared to take military action against Jordan if and when they annex the West Bank. And so we could see we could see Saudi Arabia behaving very similarly in terms of if they have this sort of unconditional military support from the United States. We saw what MBS did before with his invasion of Yemen. It's my hope is maybe he's matured a bit and has learned, but I do think that he would be very likely to behave quite similarly to Israel if he was given this same sort of open-ended American military support for whatever he chose to do.
And the value of this from the perspective of, I mean, honestly, of Saudi Arabia, it's very little in terms of like what they would have to do for a trade-off. They already do business with the Israelis. They just don't do it formally because of how hated the United States and Israel is in the region. So they basically just do formalize what they're already doing. And then they could get military and security guarantees from the United States, as you say, in the same way that we've entangled ourselves with Israel. It's astounding. But this was the trajectory that was set off by Trump with the Abraham Accords, continued by Biden. I mean, we mentioned Brett McGurk here. McGurk's role was he was kept on by Biden. Right. He was in the Trump administration. Like, if you could just talk about the destabilizing force of this, the destabilizing effects of now across potentially 3 different 4-year terms of American presidencies, pursuing this normalization deal and potentially offering weapons and security guarantees for Saudi Arabia.
Exactly. I mean, I think that while there are some ways that Biden and Trump will be different, unfortunately, on foreign policy, they're likely to be very similar, including the hawkishness towards China, hawkishness towards Iran. I worry that things may be worse under Trump, given his selection of personnel for his cabinet and other appointments. So my concern there is that this extends far beyond just the Middle East. But absolutely, that this same sort of this notion that it is in America's interest for Israel to have normalized relations with its Arab neighbors in order to sort of have a unified anti-Iran coalition is just deeply destabilizing. And Israel may see that as perhaps being in its own interest, but it is not in American interests. Partly just because the United States is not fundamentally threatened by Iran. Iran cannot harm the United States except to the extent that there are American troops that continue to be stuck in places like Syria and Iraq, where their missions have been completed, and yet they're sitting there, sitting ducks for Iranian armed militias to continue attacking. So, I mean, my hope moving forward, and I do think that we are seeing a generational shift here in terms of Americans who've been so horrified by what Israel has done to the Palestinian people, that we are unlikely to continue to see the same level of support. You know, the Israel lobby remains quite powerful in the United States, but it has to spend more resources, more money to achieve what it used to be able to do, kind of without even trying all that hard, because there was such bipartisan support for this notion that that the interests of the Israeli government and the interests of the U.S. government were so aligned. And I do want to make clear, I mean, for the Israeli people, I've been in touch with people in Israel who are so tired of the war, the same way Palestinians are obviously so exhausted by the war and, going on 100, soon 100 years of occupation, if you kind of go back beyond the creation of the state of Israel, that I do think it's very important to keep in mind that there are many people inside Israel who do want the war to end. At the same time, I did think it was instructive that you continue to hear this notion that Palestinians don't want peace. And yet it was, these scenes of incredible joy in Gaza, elsewhere in the Arab world, of people celebrating when they thought that a ceasefire deal was happening, whereas you're seeing all this backpedaling from the Israeli government and, so many Israeli media sources bemoaning the idea that there could be a ceasefire and a release of these hostages. So I do think it's just instructive of, well, who's really underneath, who's driving this conflict here. And in many ways, this does go back to America's unconditional support for Israel and going back to America's potential unconditional support for Saudi Arabia, which would be incredibly destabilizing.
And just is something that we need to be monitoring extremely closely. But the overarching, back to the point that you made about how Gaza harmed the Democrats' electoral chances in this race, like, I'm curious, as somebody who works in the foreign policy field as, an academic and has worked in the State Department, there have been a lot of, I would say, leftists who have written for years about the disconnect between public opinion and foreign policy. And I don't know if there's actually, since Bush, Bush and Biden in the past, or in my lifetime at the very least, have really, I think, driven that wedge even further. And I think it undercut the ability for the Democrats to talk about Donald Trump's threat as a threat to democracy, when democracy also is weighed by your responsiveness, not on election day, but on all of the other days. And, you see that also, but in Israel, you're right that there are Israelis that are pushing back against this, but unfortunately, still the majority opinion within Israel, and it's maybe not in Tel Aviv, it's maybe more in the settlements and outside of the cities, that you don't see it as visibly on the streets. But the majority sentiment within Israel is still pro-genocide. So Netanyahu has that coalition, or that to worry about for his own political ambitions. But then in the United States, for Trump, for all his faults, he's still at least he tries to engage in this in a transactional way, and he has a million faults, and I don't trust him. But I could see him being more swayed by that element of public opinion than Biden was.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree with you that I think Trump is more in touch with where public sentiment is on this issue. And I hope that members of the MAGA coalition are still paying attention. I mean, unfortunately, I do think that a big part of who Trump is listening to on this is the sort of evangelical Christian base, whose main interest is to have the Jews in Israel in order to bring about the second coming of Christ, which seems a little crazy that this
and
is
then most of those Jews die in that event.
Exactly.
Yes.
And that you have the Israeli government openly, willingly partnering not only with these people, but also with members of the far right in Europe. I mean, there's been a long ongoing campaign of partnership there. I agree with you, though, that in general, under Biden, under previous administrations, we do see an extreme disconnect between American foreign policy and American public opinion. I hope that we'll start to see a bit of a shift with Trump. And, I know people are probably tired of hearing this, but the old institutional mechanisms of calling your member of Congress, we at the Quincy Institute do outreach on the Hill, and we know that Hill staffers confirm that, when a constituent calls in about an issue, they take a tally, so calling your member of Congress, calling your senator can have a big impact. I know it can feel super frustrating. I feel frustrated by it as a resident of Washington, D.C., where we don't have a voting member of Congress that we can call, which is maddening. But you know, I really wish I did have representation in Congress. You know, in addition to that, I hope that as the Democrats are thinking about the upcoming elections, they will really reconsider this sort of false notion that foreign policy doesn't decide elections, because we've seen Trump successfully campaign in two different elections on being the less hawkish candidate, being the candidate of peace, which I think is somewhat nonsensical. But when you're looking at who he's up against, people like Hillary Clinton, for example, or Biden/Harris actively funding a genocide, it's not hard that he's able to sort of fill that role. So
it's by default, basically.
Exactly. It's by default. So, you know, I think it has been extremely instructive, like that poll that I mentioned earlier about how Gaza actually was a huge issue and why you just didn't see the numbers for Harris that you'd seen for Biden. It wasn't that necessarily that, you know, Trump won so many more. It was just people didn't feel motivated to get out and vote for Harris. And now we know the most important issue was Gaza, which is kind of shocking when you think about it.
Right. I do think that, you know, people just said, I can't put my support behind this. And the messaging around Trump's threat just rang so much more hollow over, like, because of diminishing returns and the fact that he was no longer in power. And that's going to be some of the lessons from this election.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.